technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
Okay, so what is MVC? Well, this thing's been around for quite a while, actually. As you can see here, well, being that it's 2009 at the time of this recording, it's been around for 31 years, right? And as you can see, it was originally released with Smalltalk, which is one of the earlier object-oriented programming languages, and it was at Xerox. In recent years, though, MVC has been used as a web framework. Primarily, though, before it was introduced with ASP.NET, it was used by Java developers. Java developers and Ruby developers have used it with, well, as it shows here, Jakarta struts. They were the first one to come up with the MVC, but then Ruby on Rails, JSF, Spring, and there were some other frameworks as well that also supported MVC for creating web applications. And it's funny how long it's taken for the ASP.NET platform or the Microsoft platform to come around to MVC. It's been a long time that Java's had this. I used to joke about how, hey, you want to know what's coming down the pipe from Microsoft? See what Java's doing now and we'll have it in 5 years. Well, that's not always true, and it may not always be the best barometer for what's coming down the pipe, but it seems more and more when I talk to my Java developers of what they're doing and I tell them some of the new things in the .NET world, they're like, yeah, we had that 5 years ago. Well, okay, cool. At least I can see what the original, I can always discuss what the original plans were for MVC and things of that nature. MVC is a direct separation of concerns, where literally you will have a separate dedicated piece of code who's in charge of controlling the request as it comes in. You'll have a model who's in charge of getting access to the data and formulating the data for your actual application for its needs. And you'll have a view that's in charge entirely of just the view. Break all of these into separate pieces, if you will, into separate classes or even methods, or even separate .NET assemblies. Breaking it up actually makes it simpler to work on each of these three components. Like right now in the ASP.NET form world, we have one page and perhaps a code behind with it, and that thing is entirely in charge of the controller, in charge of the view, and in charge of the model. Plus, you're giving up some control to the actual ASP.NET form world. You're basically saying, alright, you're in charge of actually spitting this out as HTML, and I have to just keep my fingers crossed and count on the capability of me being able to at least modify these forms slightly so I get the exact output I'm looking for. With MVC, you're entirely in charge of exactly what output will be sent to the client. That frees us up as developers. We have a lot more power here. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility. That was a Spider-Man reference. And that, of course, means that if we're entirely in charge of everything that's sent off to the client, as you guys are going to see with the views, that means we have a lot more programming to do. Okay? Still, a lot of developers feel this is worth it. They'd rather have more control than less programming. Note that there are no hard set of rules, right, for MVC, but instead they're conventions. Now there are other MVC models that are currently available. You may have heard of Monorail. Monorail is not based on Mono, but instead it's just based on .NET, and it's another way of doing MVC applications. It's been around for a long time. Unfortunately, Microsoft just came out with this one, and more people are going to more likely be doing this form of MVC programming. MVC, of course, is an entirely new way of developing our ASP.NET pages. And as I mentioned before, Monorail has already been out, and this is an alternative way of creating MVC applications. Even if you use the ASP.NET Model View Controller, you can still use your own unit testing engine, and you can also use your own view engine. I'm just going to show you the basic ones that come along with the MVC framework, but just know that any of the pieces, well, all of them in MVC are completely open source, and you can make modifications to them yourself. For example, the view engine that I mentioned, you can use the view engine that comes with ASP.NET MVC, or you can use a different one that you may download off the internet or create custom. Test-driven development, well, yeah, you can use the unit testing that's built into Visual Studio, but you may want to use NUnit or MBUnit. I'll talk about those shortly. Really, MVC is based on this inversion of control principle. No central piece of code is in charge of executing your application. By having a controller, by having the view and the model separated, each of them can worry about their little piece, and then they all just flow together. There are some hard set rules that you'll have to follow when creating controllers and views and such, but nonetheless, it makes sense once you understand the basic gist of this thing. Now, why should we even bother with this? Well, there's a lot of bullet points I've got listed here why we should bother with ASP.NET MVC. One of them, maybe we just hate the resource wastefulness of standard ASP.NET forms. Maybe we want more control over the HTML and JavaScript that's sent to the client. This can be especially true if we're doing AJAX programming on the client side. Maybe you want to be in charge of exactly what JavaScript will be included with the page. Maybe you're having trouble with your HTML controls or your tables and how they're being displayed. When you're dealing with ASP.NET web forms and their web controls, you really give up some of that control. Navigation can be a real bear. And then up in the query string, we're dealing with those ASPX hyperlinks, right? Or ASPX query strings. And instead, we like something a little bit cleaner. And we'll talk about that with routing. Right? Something else that is available, and something you should keep in mind, is you may have heard of the ORM tools that are built into Visual Studio, like Link to SQL or Entity Model. And mind you, that stuff is changing dramatically from .NET 3.5, Service Pack 1, over to .NET 4.0. So I'd recommend kind of avoiding that stuff until .NET 4.0 is released and learning that version of the Entity Framework instead. Entity Framework is being completely rewritten from .NET 3.5 to .NET 4.0, and it's a way of actually abstracting out the data that might exist in your data sources, like your databases, your XML files, or what have you, and working and exposing them in a model that makes sense to your application, and then you'll write your application directly against this Entity Framework. Now, Microsoft took a lot of feedback for .NET 3.5 from the developers who did not have a lot of positive things to say about it and said, hey, start over. This is really bad. We want it more usable. And in .NET 4.0, that's exactly what Microsoft is doing. By the way, I like the last bullet point there. Hey, if you're tired of working with boring old web forms right now and you want to try something new and cool, by all means, check out this ASP.NET MVC. Mind you, this is part of Visual Studio 2010. This will be one of our web application project types. Thankfully, it looks very similar to the way we create MVC applications with Visual Studio 2008. It's a separate download that you must install in Visual Studio 2008, but once you have it there, you can go ahead and create your old ASP.NET MVC applications. Why not? Well, this is something to keep in mind. Why not considering ASP.NET MVC? If you already have an existing web forms project, or you have several of them or several hundred of them, well, then it just makes more sense to stick with that architecture. Don't rewrite them all completely into MVC just to say, hey, I'm doing MVC. That doesn't make any sense at all. Instead, you probably want to keep it as a web forms project, because web form projects are not going away. They're very popular, they're easy to program against, and some people don't mind giving that control over to ASP.NET for how those controls are created, and the JavaScript is created as well. Maybe you prefer working with ASP.NET Server controls. Maybe you've created your own custom controls and you want to use those. By all means, stick with your standard web form application projects or your websites. That's something else I should mention. If you're doing MVC programming, you cannot do this with the website architecture. It must be a web application project, or a WAP. That's what I call them here in my slide deck. WAP, W-A-P. MVC is only supported with the WAP, web application project type. Websites, which are just a loose collection of web pages, which are all compiled the first time each of the files are requested, and they're automatically compiled into little DLLs, that doesn't support MVC, although it does have a nicer deployment model in some ways. Prefer to use automatic state management. Simple things like view state that we take for granted in web form programming are no longer there with MVC. You're in charge of managing all your state.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.